The journey to the Thaqafites at Ta'if in 620 of the Common Era, the discourse with the pilgrims from Medina who believed in Islam and spread the knowledge thereof in their native town in the same year, the vision of the midnight journey to Jerusalem and the heavens, the meeting by night at Aqaba, a mountain near Mecca, in the 11th year of his mission, and the pledges of fealty there given him, the command given to the believers to immigrate to Yathrib, henceforth Madinat Nabi, the city of the Prophet, or Al-Madinah, the city, in April of 622 of the Common Era, the escape of Muhammad and Abu Bakr from Mecca to the cave of Thawr. So obviously he was the one doing the persecuting, right? The flight to Medina on June 20th of 622, the treaties made with the Christian tribes, increasing, but still very imperfect. Acquaintance with Christian doctrines, the Battle of Badr in the 2nd year of the Hijrah. Out of Uhud, the coalition formed against Muhammad by the Jews and the idolatrous Arabians issuing in the siege of Medina. In year 5 of the Hijrah, or 627 of the Common Era, the convention with reference to the liberty of making the pilgrimages of Hudaybiyah, the liberty making the pilgrimage, it wasn't the pilgrimage of Hudaybiyah, but of Hudaybiyah, Hijrah the 6th year, the embassy to Khosrows, king of Persia, in the same year, the governor of Egypt, and to the king of Abyssinia, desiring them to embrace Islam, the conquest of several Jewish tribes, not because they were Jewish, but, because of this aforementioned thing mentioned, the most important of which was that of Khaybar in the 7th year of the Hijrah, a year marked by the embassy sent to Heraclius, then in Syria, on his return from the Persian campaign, and by a solemn and peaceful pilgrimage to Mecca, the triumphant entry into Mecca in the 8th year of the Hijrah, 630 of the Common Era, and the demolition of the idols at the Kaaba, the submission of the Christians of Najran, of Elah, of the Red Sea, and of Taif, etc., in Hijrah 9, called the Year of Ambassadors, or disputations, from the numerous numerous deputations which flocked to Mecca, proffering submission. At last, in the 10th year, Al-Hijrah, the submission of Hadramaut, Yemen, the greater part of the southern and eastern provinces of Arabia, and the final solemn pilgrimage to Mecca. While, however, there is no great difficulty in ascertaining the suwar which stand in connection with the more salient features of Muhammad's life, it is a much more arduous and often impractical task to point out the precise events to which the individual verses refer, and out of which they sprung. Well, we don't see, it doesn't make sense when looking at a whole to say that the Quran is somehow some sort of biography of Muhammad or something. It is quite possible that Muhammad himself, in the latter period of his career, he wasn't the prophet for money, basically. So it's an odd word. It's an odd word, because of that implication. But no, he wasn't a professional prayer leader, even. Designedly mixed up later with earlier revelations in the same suwar, not for the sake of producing that mysterious style which seems so pleasing to the mind of those who value truth, lest when it is most clear and obvious, but for the purpose of softening down some of the earlier statements which represent the last hour and awful judgment as imminent, and thus leading his followers to continue still in the attitude of expectation, and to see in his latter successes the truth of his earlier predictions. If afterthoughts of this kind are to be traced, they will often strike the attentive reader. It then follows that the perplexed state of the text in individual suwar is to be considered as due to Muhammad himself, and we are furnished with a series of constant hints for attaining to chronological accuracy. And it may be remarked in passing that a belief that the end of all things was at hand may have tended to promote the earlier successes of Islam at Mecca, as it is unquestionably was an argument with the apostles to flee from the wrath to come. Well, there were many signs that they were told outside of the Quran that didn't put it that near to their generation. You know, it was going to be at least 40 years or something. It must be. Well, I mean, still all signs haven't come, so it must be borne in mind that the allusions to contemporary minor events and to the local efforts made by the new manifestation of religion to gain the ascendant are very few, and often couched in terms so vague and general that we are forced to interpret the Quran solely by the Quran itself, and for this the frequent repetitions of the same histories and the same sentiments afford much facility, and they have different effects in different places, and different linguistic styles and stuff like that too, and the peculiar manner in which the details of each history are increased by fresh traits at each recurrence enables us to trace their growth in the author's mind and ascertain the manner in which a part of the Quran was composed. The absence of the historical element for the Quran as regard to details of Muhammad's daily life may be judged by the fact that one of his two contemporaries are mentioned, that only two of his contemporaries are mentioned in the entire volume, and that Muhammad's name occurs but 5 times. One is Ahmed. Although he is the way through addressed by the angel Gabriel as the recipient of the divine revelations, with the words say, perhaps such passages as Surah 2:15, page 339 in James Rodwell's translation, and verse 246 of Surah 2 on page 365 of the same translation, and the constant mention of guidance, direction, wandering may have been suggested by reminiscences of his mercantile journeys in his earlier years. Now, it would have been something that would have been best for the messenger that would have received it, right? It may be considered quite certain that it was not customary to reduce to writing any traditions concerning Muhammad himself, for at least in the greater part of a century, they rested entirely on the memory of those who have handed them down, and must necessarily have been colored by their prejudices and convictions, to say nothing of the tendency to the formation of myths and to actual fabrication, which early shews itself, especially in the interpretations of the Quran, to subserve and purposes of the contending factions of the Umayyads, the Muawiyah, the Abbasids, and the Abbasids. It was under the 5th Caliph al-Mamun, well, Hussein was caliph, wasn't he? But he wasn't as accepted among the Shiites because that interferes with the acceptance of the Muawiyah dynasty. But that three writers mentioned below, on whom we mainly depend for all really reliable information, flourished, and even their writings are necessarily colored by the theological tendencies of their master and patron, who was a decided partisan of the divine right of Ali and his descendants. Now, Ali ibn Talib didn't made clear that people shouldn't be accepted just because of who they're, who they knew or who they were related to. So that wasn't. Now, I guess some people made that argument, but for the most part, that's not really the Shia argument. Ali, Hassan, Hussein, yes, but and so forth. But it wasn't because of their lineage, basically. The incidences mentioned in the Quran itself, for the interpretation of which early tradition is available, are comparatively few, and there are many passages with which it is totally at variance, as, for instance, that Muhammad worked miracles, which the Quran expressly disclaims. Traditions can never be considered as at all reliable unless they are traceable to some common origin, have descended to us by independent witnesses, and correspond with the statements of the Quran itself, always, of course, deducting such texts as, which is not unfrequently the case, to have themselves given rise to the tradition. And people remember the situations. People remember the commentary that was put down. So if you really have a prophet that receives revelation and receives inspiration, then you're going to have both of them. And you find inklings of that in. It's harder because the Bible is the claims, the revelation, the inspiration, the sacred history, and the commentary of the scholars was, these things are all in one thing in the Bible, and they were composed and edited by many authors over many centuries. Probably some of the books probably initially composed by multiple people and then put together as one book. And it soon becomes obvious to the reader of the Muslim traditions and commentators that both miracles and historical events have been mentioned for the sake of expounding a dark and perplexing text. And you look at it with its variety of meaning, and you consider, of course, the people that initially responded to it. Not so much. It's entirely usable, even without modern science telling us that there are stars that knock and stars that put off light that go through things and other weird things the Quran says that turns out to be scientifically understandable. And that even the earlier traditions are largely tinged with a mythical element. Now, mythical is different than ideological, because in the way that mythical involves this meaning. It involves the spiritual reality as a present thing. In that, the first biographer of Muhammad of whom we have any information was Zuhri, who died in 124, the Common Era. Of Al-Hijra. Okay, most of the dates have been the Common Era, so I've jumped to that first. Age 72, but his works, though abundantly quoted by later writers, are no longer extant. Much of his information was derived from Urwa, who died in 94, and was a near relative of Aisha, the Prophet's favorite wife. Ibn Ishaq, who died in 151, Al-Hijra, and who had been a hearer of Zuhri, composed a biography of Muhammad for the use of Caliph al-Mansur. On this work, considerable remains of which have come down to us. Ibn Hisham, who died in 213 Al-Hijra, based his life of Muhammad. Al-Waqidi of Medina, who died in 207 Al-Hijra, composed a biographical work which has reached us in an abbreviated form through his secretary, Katib. It is composed entirely of traditions. Tabari, the Libby of the Arabians, given 51, note 1. I have an abbreviated Gibbon's history thing, but I'm sure that's what they mean, because Gibbon's history of the Roman Empire. Who died at Baghdad in 310 Al-Hijra, composed Annals of Muhammad's Life and of the Progress of Islam. These ancient writers are the principal sources whence anything like authentic information as to the life of Muhammad has been derived, and it has been safely concluded that after diligent investigations carried on by the professional collectors of traditions in the 2nd century after Al-Hijra, well, this is the 2nd through 5th centuries when the big collections were written, but there were smaller collections and people privately compiled stuff from the start. Of course, there was a focus on the Quran, so some people wrote only that. That little or nothing remains to be added to our stories of information relative to the details of Muhammad's life are the facts which may further illustrate the text of the Quran. Well, it depends on how much of these traditional texts you have access to. I've taken on quite the undertaking there to. I want to read the Big Ten every decade, and that's still not the easiest to get a hold of. And there's earlier ones. But however this may be, no records which are posterior in date to these authorities can be considered as at all deserving dependence. To consider, says Dr. Springer, late historians like Abulfeda as authorities, and to suppose that an account gangs in certainty because it is mentioned by several of them is highly uncritical. Like Muhammad, page 73. The sources whence Muhammad derived the materials of his Quran are, over and above the more poetical parts, which are his own, the legends of his time and country. Which, why didn't he pick up any of the errors that we've disproved about some of these things since? Jewish traditions based on the Talmud are perverted to suit his own purposes, and the floating Christian traditions of Arabia and of South Syria. At a later period of his career, no one would venture to doubt the divine origin of the entire book, but at its commencement, the case was difficult. The people of Mecca spoke openly and tauntingly of it as the work of a poet, as a collection of antiquated or fabulous legends, or as palpable sorcery. They accused him of having confederates and even specified foreigners who had been his coadjutors. Now, Moses and various ones, and Jesus and stuff, were accused of quite similar things, from what we understand. Such were Solomon the Persian, to whom he may have owed the descriptions of heaven and hell, which are analogous to those of the Zen Avesta. Now, we know that actually the Art of Vivaroth wasn't written down until 100 years after the Quran, so that puts certain questions there. Now, it could have existed for 3,000 years or something, or 2,000 years or something, but it's, And the Christian monk Sergius, or as the Muslims term him, Buhaira, from the latter, and perhaps from other Christians, especially slaves naturalized at Mecca. Muhammad obtained access to the teachings of the apocryphal Gospels and of many popular traditions, at which these Gospels are the concrete expression. His wife Khadija, as well as her cousin Waraqah, a reputed convert to Christianity, and Muhammad's intimate friend, are said to have both been well acquainted with the doctrines and sacred books of both Jews and Christians. And not only were several Arab tribes in the neighborhood of Mecca converts to the Christian faith, but on 2 occasions Muhammad had traveled with his uncle Abu Talib as far as Basra, where he must have had opportunities of learning the general outlines of Oriental Christian doctrine, and perhaps of witnessing the ceremonial of their worship, and it appears tolerably certain that previous to and at the period of his entering into public life, there was a large number of inquirers at Mecca who, like Zayd, Umayyah, Taif, Waraka, etc., were dissatisfied equally with the religion of their fathers, the Judaism and the Christianity which they saw around them, and were anxiously inquiring for some better way. There are still people who they find, they want to believe in the sources for this, but they don't know, what among the Bible represents those sources, and what of the church traditions and rabbinical traditions are true. The names and details of the lives of 12 of the companions of Muhammad who lived in Mecca, Medina, and Taif are recorded, who previous to his assumption of the prophetic office called themselves Hanifs, i.e. the converts, the Puritans, and were believers in one God and regarded Abraham as the founder of their religion. And there's people who had fragments, and this is what they were, but they didn't really have the organized religion guidance. They didn't really know much. Abraham was a monotheist, and Muhammad publicly acknowledged that he was a Hanif, and the sect of the Hanifites, who are in no way to be confounded with the latter sect of the same name, were among his Meccan precursors. Their history is to be found in the Fihrist manuscript, Paris, Fons, Nur 874, and in other treatises, which Dr. Springer believes to have been in the library of the Caliph al-Mamun. In this treatise, the Hanifs are termed Sebites and said to have received the volumes Sohof, are books of Abraham, mentioned in Surah 87:19, page 40 and 41 of the J.M. Rodwell translation, which most commentators affirm to have been borrowed from them, as is also the case with the latter part of Surah 53:37, page 71, so that from these books Muhammad derived the legends of Ad and Thamud, whose downfall, recent as it was, he throws back to a period previous to that of Moses, and was made to ask, Surah 14:9, page 226 of this volume, whether their history had reached his hearers. Muhammad is said to have discovered these books to be a recent forgery, and that this is the reason why no mention of them occurs after the 4th year of the prophetic function, 616 of the Common Era. Well, there's not proof that the chronology has got a little bit different. There certainly was changes around Arabia more recent than Moses, but that's not quite the same thing. Hence, too, possibly the title of Hanif was so soon dropped and exchanged for that of Muslim. one who surrenders or resigns himself to God. The Waraqah above mentioned and cousin of Khadija is said to have believed on Muhammad as long as he continued true to the principles of the Hanifs, but to have quitted him in disgust at his subsequent proceedings, and to have died an Orthodox Christian. Now, who says that? It has been supposed that Muhammad derived many of his notions concerning Christianity from Gnosticism, and that it is to the numerous Gnostic sects the Quran alludes, well, not in the way that would make Muhammad an antichrist, because certainly Islam believes in a physical incarnation, and literally takes him as Messiah, Emmanuel, Christ. So, they certainly weren't worshippers. And that it is to the numerous Gnostic sects which the Quran alludes when it reproaches the Christians with having split up their religion into parties. Well, more than that, but because obviously people knew with Catholic and some different groups. But for Muhammad, thus to have confounded Gnosticism with Christianity itself, its prevalence in Arabia must have been far more universal than we have any reason to believe it really was. Well, again, not quite. We can show reasons why this was not the case, but in fact, we have no historical authority for supposing that the doctrines of these heretics were taught or professed in Arabia at all. Okay, that's actually some is about an earth, but again, it's different than the sort of thing professed in the Quran. It is certain, on the other hand, that the Basilidans, Valentinians, and other Gnostic sects had either died out or been absorbed into the Orthodox Church. By Orthodox, I mean the Catholic Church. The Orthodox didn't split off for, a while after that, but toward the middle of the 5th century of the Common Era, and had disappeared from Egypt before the 6th. It is nevertheless possible that the Gnostic doctrine concerning the crucifixion was adopted by Muhammad as likely to reconcile the Jews to Islam, as a religion embracing both Judaism and Christianity, if they might believe that Jesus had not been put to death, and thus find the stumbling block of the atonement removed out of their path. Well, the Quran talks about people dying, but no one ever died for anybody's sins. And doesn't Jesus kind of indicate you got to take up your cross and follow him in the Bible? Because he knew that people had been crucified. He didn't have to mean he was necessarily promoting the idea that he was going to be crucified himself or something. But that was typical with a lot of these savior myths, is the savior was crucified. But this real stumbling block there would have been this idea: the Jews had Jesus killed, and certainly some of them tried earlier, but the Jews would in this case have simply been called upon to believe in Jesus as being what the Quran represents him, a holy teacher who, like the patriarch Enoch or the prophet Elijah, had been miraculously taken from the earth. Well, the Quran does not actually make that belief necessary. But another thing there is that because Christians make him out to be a god, there was a lot of slander on the Jewish part. But in all other respects, the sober and matter-of-fact statements of the Quran relative to the family and history of Jesus are altogether opposed to the wild and fantastic doctrines of the Gnostic emanations, and especially to the manner in which they suppose Jesus at his baptism to have been brought into union with higher nature. It is quite clear that Muhammad agreed with in several points with the doctrines of the Ebionites, Essenes, Sabians, and Epiphanius. Our 10 describes the notions of the Ebionites, of Nebathah, Moabites, and Basanites with regard to Adam and Jesus in almost every word of Surah 3:52. He tells us that they observed circumcision, were opposed to celibacy forbade turning to the sunrise, but enjoined Jerusalem as their Qibla, as in Muhammad during 12 years, that they prescribed, as did the Sabites, washings very similar to those enjoined in the Quran, and allowed oaths by certain natural objects, as clouds, as signs of the zodiac, oil, winds, etc., which you find adopted in the Quran. Of course, Islam does not teach that a human being is allowed to swear by anything except God, but it's God swearing by this, that, and the other, God calling the reference to this to bring the attention and to the truth of this, These points of contact with Islam, knowing as we do Muhammad's eclecticism, can hardly be accidental. Now, if there was a true prophet, wouldn't this prophet confirm the truth of what was there from the previous? Wouldn't no group except the new revelation have all the guidance, and maybe some guidance that had been lost or corrupted would be seen as new and unique, but not really, but it really wasn't, We have no evidence that Muhammad had access to the Christian scriptures, though it is just possible that fragments of the Old and New Testament, as they're called, may have reached him through Khadija or Warqa or other Meccan Christians visiting manuscripts of their sacred volume. Well, we find that the presence of Christianity was likely, and that certain people did have volumes that were brought forth, but the sacred volume. There is but one quotation from Surah 21:105 in the whole Quran from the scriptures, although there are a few passages where alms are said to be given to be seen of men, and as none forgiveth sins but God only, which might seem to be identical with the text of the New Testament, yet in the similarity it is probably merely accidental. And